Unsolicited advice to adolescent boys with ripped blue jeans and very neat handwriting. After Jean Anverly. When your high school social worker asks you if you have thought about killing yourself, do not roll your eyes. When the pretty girl with the pretty hair and the pretty house and the pretty smile who drives her mother's Lexus or her mother's BMW or her mother's Infiniti SUV says she won't give you a ride home unless you give her some gas money, buy a bike. Learn to skateboard or walk. You could use the exercise and you will not be this girl's first pretty lesson in confusing decency with charity. When the boy with the bad acne and curly hair offers you half of his sandwich, take it. Say thank you. Then actually eat it. The first time that your mother asks you if you are gay, say no. The second time that your mother asks you if you are gay, say you do not know. The third time that your mother asks you if you're gay, say it sure sounds like she's already made up her mind, so maybe stop asking, Mom. When the tall, handsome boy with dimples like thumbtacks takes your hand at your first pride parade and says, let's make out in front of the protesters, say no. When he grabs you before you have a chance to respond, push him. When he pulls you in closer and forces his way inside of your mouth, bite his tongue. Grab a picket sign. You are 16 years old, have never kissed a boy in public, and will not let this day, for all of its pride and glitter and queer boy fabulous, be the first time that someone uses your body to make their point. When they sign you up for therapy, after you burn the word help into the upholstery of your mother's car, do not curse them for listening. Do not burn flesh. When they sign you up for therapy, go. When your father tries to sign you up for the Boy Scouts, do not go. When your father buys a boat instead of paying for child support, go sailing. When your mother's mother dies, write her eulogy, write her holy again, go the funeral. When your mother dies, bite your tongue, go the funeral. When your brother dies, go to the funeral. When your sister dies, go to the funeral. Do not plan your own. Do not pick out flowers. Do not burn flesh. Do not shrug off love like the broken promise you have been taught that it is. When you pull the first empty bottle from beneath your mother's bathroom sink, put it back. When you pull the fifth empty bottle from beneath your mother's bathroom sink, pretend you didn't see it. When you pull the 15th empty bottle from beneath your mother's bathroom sink, just throw them away. Do not line them all up like so many stone-faced soldiers eager for a fight, or a uniformed infantry fixed to the kitchen countertop. You have enough at war in your life without assembling an army from your mother's stolen shame. When your father buys a boat, go sailing. When your father buys a wife, take her sailing. When your father's wife calls you a faggot, call her by her name, her real name. Not the one that your father branded her with when he bought her. Remind her how she has been bought. Do not blame her. Do not burn flesh. If you must, burn his drapes. Burn his bed sheets. Burn his porn. Do not burn your flesh when your father kicks you out for the last time. Ask him, are you not his last living child? Are you not his blood? Are you not his problem to love? When you leave your mother's house for the last time, ask yourself, are you not her last living child? Are you not her blood? Is she not your problem to love? And then, no matter the answer, you leave. When your high school social worker asks you if you've thought about killing yourself, do not roll your eyes. Tell her the truth. And then, no matter the answer, you live. Wasn't that fun? That's how I like to meet people, is with a poem, right? So now you know an awfully lot about me, and we can just talk like we're besties. So, besties, my name is Kevin Kantor, and I am a poet, and you needn't ask me if I didn't even know it, because I do, I just told you. But I'm actually here to make the case for the fact that I really believe that we all have the capacity to be really profound poets in our own sense. And even if you are someone who really believes that you have this deep, prolific, prophetic, poetic prowess, ooh, rhymes, deep within you, or if you're like, nah, words ain't really my jam, that even still, we all have something incredibly beneficial to learn from attending poetry venues and open mics, and maybe even integrating some models of communication that poets use in our day-to-day lives to become more effective and empathic communicators with our peers. You dig? So I will warn you now that during my talk, there is a poetry prompt. You're gonna write a little, ooh, it's interactive now, there's a poet. And if you're like, nah, Kevin, I can't because I didn't bring anything to write with. Psych, you have phones, and I'm gonna give you full permission to take them out when we get to that point of the talk. I'm 23 years old, I usually write on something that goes beep. So don't worry, I will walk you through it. It will be super fun, and you are all gonna leave here being poets. But before we get there, I wanna talk a little bit about my journey with poetry, how I found it, and how it's really changed my life. So the first poetry slam I ever attended, I was 19 years old in Boulder, Colorado at the Innisfree Poetry Bookstore. It is one of 3 bookstores in the entire country that sells exclusively poetry, and I was immediately taken with the art form, and most importantly with the space in which the art form was being presented. And by space, I don't necessarily mean the bookstore itself, while that bookstore is absolutely incredible and holds a very near and dear place in my heart, but rather the space and the atmosphere and the environment that was created by the work and the people and the community that was existing in that room, right? I walked into this space where immediately I felt like it was safe to express personal narratives in a way that I never had before. It was a very visceral example and exhibition of what it means to be an empathic communicator. This really spoke to me because until that point, and still, I was an actor and am an actor by trade. So I have a 4-year degree in acting from college, and my dad is super proud of me. But really, what I love to tell people about my experience as a student of theater arts is that I had the privilege for 4 years to study empathy and the practice of being an empathic communicator, right? As an actor, it is very literally my job to step into the role of someone else and then rework and reframe those experiences through a lens of my own understanding. So spoken word really, really touched that part of my passion in regards to empathic communication. But unlike theater arts, in which I was assuming a role, a character, here were these people being incredibly vulnerable, and there was this implicit understanding between audience and poet that the poets were speaking from personal experience. And vulnerability was something that sort of vulnerability I'd never seen before. I'd never seen it, that visceral and that close and tangible to home, And when I say vulnerability, I mean really it can be 2 things, right? Whether it's unpacking trauma or celebrating joy. I think both of those things are inherently vulnerable, and we often only think of the prior as a space of vulnerability. So this empathic communication really, really spoke to me. And I would make the argument that we can all learn to be more empathic by watching and going to poetry events, because unlike also theater arts, it is right now, real time, and it encourages response. It is a live conversation, spoken word poetry, between the audience and the poet and performer, meaning the snap is so real, y'all. You're allowed. If you're feeling it, you can let me know. And that conversation, that safety of knowing that you're heard, because for so long growing up, as a youth, if you will, although I still feel that way most days, I was afraid to speak out for fear of not being heard, let alone understood. And here was a venue in which people were telling me actively, I hear you and I see you. And that was wonderful. So that is the what, right? What is a poetry venue? And I think that you might say, okay, great. You're telling me go to slams and I will immediately become empathetic, and that's wonderful, and now I'm a magician. No, I'm not making that case exactly. So what is poetry? If you're like, I'm not a poet, so like, what do I have to learn from this? I think often we think of poetry as something that stodgy old white men do. There's a truth to that, right? I think that stodgy old white men would like to fashion themselves the gatekeepers of academia, but my work is all about subverting, patriarchy and toxic masculinity and heteronormativity. So why don't we start with art? Let's do it right here, right now. So my favorite definition of poetry is from my mentor and fellow poet and all-around cool dude, Ken Arkind, and he says this of poetry. Poetry is the art of trying to define with words that which cannot be defined with words. Deep. But also sort of an anti-definition, right? What are we supposed to do with that? But I find that anti-definition incredibly freeing. It means really that definition is subjective and contextual, and poetry therefore can really mean anything to you. It's however a storytelling or personal narrative manifests to you. And there's a lot of freedom in that. There's no right or wrong or formula. Not to confuse formula with style, because of course there is style in poetry, but that we don't have to restrict ourselves to a formula. Ken Arkind also says this of our art and poetry, that we should not think of it in the dualism of good and bad, but rather honest or not honest. And I think that's really important because only we can really be barometers of how honest we are being with our stories and how honest and authentically we can share ourselves with others. So that if you're like, I'm not a good writer, well, poo on that. If you can tell a story, you can and are a poet. So I also get the question, well, what's a slam poet? What's a spoken word poet? And whenever I get those questions, I immediately think of Parks and Recreation. And Amy Poehler's character in one episode said something to the effect of, anything can be a slam poem if you say it like this. And you laugh, and I laugh too, because it's hilarious, right? But I think it also really illustrates this damning misconception about the work that I and other spoken word poets do, and that is that there is some sort of delivery or performance style that is associated with slam. And that's just not true. Slam is just a game. Think of slam as the Hunger Games or Thunderdome, whatever generation you are in. Although that reboot was dope. You can bring anything to the Hunger Games if it serves you. If you're like, this sonnet is my weapon of choice, and you want to slam this sonnet because this is your sonnet, damn it, then you are a slam poet. It's just a game in which we assign really arbitrary numbers. It's a very clever ploy that was started in the late 80s in Chicago as a means to incentivize people to come back with new work and get excited about it. This style or performance gestures or genre does not really apply to slam. Anyone can slam if you're reading a poem at a slam. So what's a spoken word poet? Word poetry that is spoken. And it is that simple, right? If you read a poem out loud, you are speaking word poetry, and you are therefore a spoken word poet. So then I get the question, well, if all of these things don't really mean anything, why do you call yourself a spoken word poet? And it goes back to that idea of space for me. My work as a spoken word poet is just as much about finding, upholding, and creating those spaces, those safe spaces to share our stories and have our stories be heard, as much as it is picking up a pen to write the stories down. That is what spoken word poetry means to me. I think that as it's become more to the forefront of our cultural consciousness, spoken word through the use of YouTube and the interwebs, and it's super, super awesome sauce that's happening. I cannot believe I just said awesome sauce. But it's really great that that's happening, but I think that it's, for me, more about that space in which we can authentically express ourselves and know that we are heard. So we're gonna create that space right now. It's poetry prompt time, y'all. That's my job, is to make it feel like you have a place in which you can express yourself. So this is what we're gonna be doing. Challenge by choice. If you're like, I'm just gonna sit this one out, that's fine. But I highly encourage you to write these short poems and then maybe tweet them at TEDxClaremont, and then I will read them, and it will be fun. So we've been talking a lot about definitions, right? So I want y'all to think of a word that you would use to define yourself. Make it a noun. Let's say like a title or a role you play in your life: poet, artist, student, teacher, brother, mother, sister, athletes, singer, whatever, what have you, right? And I want you to then write that at the top of your page, and then as if you are writing a dictionary definition entry of that word, but make it a verb instead of a noun. Here is an example. Poet. Verb. 1. To break surface. To wake. To dive deep. To hunt for gilded treasures in my own sunken chest. Whoa. Right? So, throughout, ruminate on that, do it as you will. I'm going to continue talking, but create art, well, I think we can multitask. Why do I love that exercise? Well, for me, it really illustrates what I was talking about before, about how definition is wholly contextual and subjective, and we have a lot to learn by examining why we choose the words we do to define ourselves and what those words mean to us personally, right? I just read a poem about being a poet, and someone else in this room might choose poet and have a completely different poem, right? The likelihood of you having chosen the same word as someone else in this room, pretty high, right? And where do those intersections happen? And that, to me, is a poetic act, right? Digging deeper to examine why we define ourselves the way that we do, knowing full well that we can't ever really adequately define ourselves with words. And if we do this act, this poetic act of introspection, I would make the argument that not only do we work to have a better understanding of ourselves and how we can communicate with others, but also it will help us avoid making assumptions of our peers and will allow us to communicate more empathically with other people. And I would also make the case for this being a responsibility of ours, not just something we can do, but rather something that we need to do. I think that we all collectively, especially in the climate of our country today, need to sit down and rationalize how we can become more empathetic people. Because for some, our ability to act empathically is a means of survival. And it is that big a deal, right? And if it means going to a poetry slam or sitting down and picking up a pen, I think it's worth it. Lauren Zuniga, another poet, has in one of her poems a quote that says something to the effect of, "Everything I have learned about being a good queer, I have learned from poets, and poets are cheaper than college." And it is so true, because student loans up the wazoo. But, yeah, right? And you're like, that was the first step I got. It was like, yeah, woo! But why is this important to me? I think I'm not saying drop out of college and hit up every poetry slam venue you possibly can, although I don't think that's necessarily a horrible idea either. But more so that there are things about our lives and our bodies and our minds and in everything that the powers that be don't want us to know or talk about. And I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I'm talking about the patriarchy. I'm talking about heteronormativity and systemic racism and white supremacy. These things that we are, for some reason, in many places in our country, not taught in the classroom because we think it's something that should be left at home. If you don't want to teach it in school, we should be talking about it amongst ourselves and with each other, and I think that we have that responsibility. More often than not, when we go to learn history, we do it in a classroom with a dusty book penned by the victors, in which those victors are made to be figureheads and saviors rather than actually people. When I die, and I will, I, of course, obviously hope to be remembered for the positive change I can hopefully create while I'm here. But part of me also wants to be remembered as someone who at times was utterly destroyed by love, who wept and who bled, whose favorite snack was plain Greek yogurt with fresh blackberries, and who, for many times, at least until now, didn't really know what direction he was going in. I think poetry is history that makes room for that humanity. And isn't that the history we want to teach and leave behind? Ken Arkind, love him, also said that we don't tell each other our names. We gift each other with our names. And isn't our name both our first and longest story? So my name is Kevin, and it has been a pleasure to meet you.